Welcome to the Retro 21 Studios podcast. I'm your host, M Squared. Please support the podcast by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons on our various podcast channels, such as Podbean, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. Welcome to the Retro 21 Studios podcast. I'm your host, M Squared. Today, I'm joined with Jason Brinkley. How you doing, Jason?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
Doing well. I was going through your LinkedIn profile, and there's so much rich information out there. I'm like, how in the world do I introduce Jason? Yeah. But what we'll start out by letting Jason tell about himself and what he's up to.
Thanks. So I have a PhD in statistics. I have been doing machine learning since before we called it machine learning, actually. So I actually started in the late 90s in school, wanting to explore certain methodologies that were available but were not commonplace, that have become very common by 2023. So I've been looking at a lot of this stuff for a lot of my career. I spent the first decade as a professor of biostatistics. I left academia to come do contract research. So now I'm at Apt Associates, where we work on some of the world's toughest problems. We work with governments all around the country, primarily in the United States, tackle everything from climate change to the deployment of artificial intelligence, to looking at government services, to looking at COVID, to looking at all of the things that challenge Americans and other people around the globe. And that puts me in contact with a lot of different algorithms. And so I do a lot of thinking and discussion with teams on how best to approach data and analytics for advanced problem solving.
Awesome. Thanks, Jason. And as our listeners are aware, this podcast is focused around the broad implications of artificial intelligence. And this particular series is around responsible AI. We've talked about algorithmic bias in criminal justice and in other areas. We talked a little bit about language models. This is your forte, and I'd love to gain your insights around this particular topic area. There's lots of controversy around some of the language models, where AI is going, and I'll reemphasize the algorithmic bias. That's a huge concern, whether it's hiring decisions, whether it's in the criminal justice system, you name it, those concerns are out there. So let me turn it back over to you, Jason, and get your perspective on where things are and your involvement.
Sure. I take a historical look at this because I think lots of people think AI has been around. It's new, right? It's new. It's cutting edge. It's at the frontier. These are brand new things, brand new innovations. And I would say that this is a culmination of things that have been years in the making. I think that there has been a lot of work in this for a very long time. And I think that recent innovations, and let's say the past 3 years, have really accelerated the public consciousness on some of this. I think ChatGPT was a game changer from people to see the potential usability, the potential in terms of how it's going to affect my life for normal, regular, everyday Americans. And I think that scientists and technology experts have been working in these realms for a long time, and we just have not had a product that really demonstrated the power until the large language models have burst onto the scene. You can go all the way back to the 2008 election. How did Nate Silver adequately and almost perfectly predict the presidential election of Barack Obama? He uses predictive models, which were the foundational piece for artificial intelligence, right? Yes. That has gotten more challenging since then. And I think that is in response to those models becoming available. I think humans have this notion of when our behaviors are being predicted, we would like to change behaviors to make ourselves less predictable because we don't want to be seen as widgets, as cogs. We want individualism and individual people. And I think that historical perspective is important. I think the historical perspective is also important in terms of technological development.
I was going to ask you about the technology around the transformers, compute power, all that good stuff.
Yeah. So I think when you have the discussion about why are we struggling with issues of bias in artificial intelligence, I think this historical perspective helps set the framing for it. So who has developed the vast majority of these products? They're open AI technologies. Microsoft, Google, Meta. There was a lots of heavy investment by other backers along the way, IBM, a lot of other great folks. But leading from an industry perspective, you have industry goals. You start with faster, better, cheaper, right? That is a top core philosophy in the business world. So what do you get when you develop AI under the guidelines of make it better, faster, and cheaper, right? So faster means that it really needs to ignore the hardest cases, the most esoteric cases, right? So faster would mean what can we get the most bang for our buck out of, right? That's a majority discussion. If you turn around and think about that, what works best for the most instances that we can throw out there and automate that can deal with this for the vast majority of cases? And I think the philosophy was if we could get a great solution that works great for 80% of our data or people or whatever it is that you're looking at, then we can roll that out for the 80% and then we can figure out something else for the other 20%. And I think what we've had is a 20-year history of people doing that and then turn around and not dealing with the 20%. And then that's faster. What does that mean? It has to have fast performance. You have to be able to put it in and immediately get something back. Large language models are struggling on some places with translations, right? With giving that feedback in languages that are outside of majority language realms. And when you find places where people are able to get inappropriate content back from these large language models purposefully, they've done it by translating to a more esoteric language, throwing it into the thing, and then getting outside of those parameters. Why? Because it wasn't really built for those like small end use cases. And you really look at that from that perspective, that whole framework sets it up for a majority versus minority argument. Wherever you want to look at, whatever that deployment is, if you're talking about AI for technology, for automation, for tools that people use in their everyday lives, even, or you're talking about AI for people, where we're trying to figure out better ways to triage needs, to assess risk, to do things at the human level, all those things. Everybody wants all that at the touch of their fingertips. But in some instances, there are some use cases and some data and some people where nuance matters. And nuance is hard for AI, right? It takes a long time to get there. And so the algorithm development phase was really focused on what is the most that I can get out of my buck, what is the most that I can get from this, how far can I push this technology, how far can I automate it, and that gets us to this sort of what works best for the most people argument. And that's not an equitable argument by any means. And so when you move from the traditional business cases that these technologies wanted to do, have better, faster engagement with their social media, or to have information move through the pipeline faster, or be able to give senior decision makers top level information for making executive decisions. They're really wanting to see the biggest part of the big picture, right? And all of those concerns, when you push those to the top, you have marginalization that happens just naturally. And we have suffered consequences for that. And we still suffer consequences to it today. We build new systems under the auspice of we have all this data, we have to train on all this data. And by and large, we hand it to the machines and ask them to treat it all equally.
Right.
And now we've seen a few instances of biased AI. We've seen bias in terms of how it predicts for home loans, how it predicts for criminal justice, how it predicts for government services, how it predicts for public health preparedness, all these different realms. And then when you stick that, take AI and COVID. We have a lot of great research that I've been a part of at the beginning of the COVID epidemic that really showcased that the people who were most vulnerable were the so-called frontline workers. Those are people that have also been marginalized in other processes, right? They're lower income. They're not contributing as much to the economy as higher income people from a business perspective. You see what I'm saying? They're not in their target demographics for stuff. They're not a part of the use cases they need. They might be providing services to them, in which case they need to specialize to them, right? To marginalized individuals. But if you apply AI to that, then you're just going to exacerbate those existing situations. And so then if I want to apply AI in that setting, and I want to get what's going to be the most useful information for the biggest swath of people, if we do that in America, that's going to cater to mostly white populations. So when we look at it in a government realm, let's take Medicare, for instance. Medicare is a great example. Something like 70% of Medicare recipients are white. I can build a very racist AI model for Medicare recipients that would perform very well on our measurement, on our metric. Medicare does not want to do that. That is part of their priorities, is to be equitable, to be fair in those things. But the system is set up in such a way that it prioritizes the majority, at least in terms of the traditional stuff. So much so that when you go back and look at it from that perspective, you realize there was no option other than to be biased.
That actually came up in the Amazon case study that I was looking at with respect to hiring decisions, where it was biased towards male engineers. And that was the body of data that it was dealing with. And it missed some of the subtleties that extended to the minority population.
Yeah. And I don't want your listeners to think that I feel I'm anti-AI. I'm very much pro-AI. But what I want is trustworthy AI, because I think a lot of people use the term black box, and I do not like the term black box. I think black box means that it's unknown and unknowable. I think that's what people think when they hear black box, but that's right. Not true. AI does some procedures that are unknown, but they are knowable if you put the time and the effort into it. And in some of these cases, it's knowable if we're developing new math. That's been a platform that I've stood upon some of these things, is that we have developed in the past 20 years a bunch of measures for AI performance that are grounded in faster, better, cheaper. And if we're going to pivot and say, no, we want equity to go up the top. I heard a leader at another organization give a talk similar to some of this and mention faster, better, cheaper, and fair. And they said, yeah, we want it to be faster, better, cheaper, and fair. But even when you have that discussion, do you hear how fair was an afterthought? Faster, better, cheaper, and fair. It's not an add-on. And that's really where the market's also struggling, because they would say, oh, we've already got a set of procedures. Now what we need to do is insert equity into the discussion. So I do my faster, better, cheaper, then I make it fair. But that's not the right order of operations. It should be fair, faster, better, cheaper. And we have to reconfigure the math to make that work out. And we haven't gotten there yet.
Got it. So, Jason, if I flash back, so you keep mentioning time, right? Time, the 80-20 rule, the need to spend more time with your models to fine tune them. Time equals money, right? And if you're trying to get to market faster, so say, for instance, I'm a startup organization and we could create some sort of proprietary language model from scratch, or we could go open source, right? Grab OpenAI or whatever and start working on that. And we're looking at cost, time to market. So let's just go with what we have. And then, as you mentioned earlier, we'll fine tune it on an as needed basis. Is that consistent with what you're describing?
It is, but I'd like to see it accelerated in a couple of ways. I would like to have more. I'm hopeful that the future career of interest is an algorithm evaluation specialist. We need that line of careers in addition to artificial intelligence development and programming and coding and all of this. I feel like if you develop a proprietary model, it should be certified by somebody. We have evaluators that do program evaluation. We do evaluation of all these other realms, but we're also right now letting the people who develop AI also be the evaluators of AI. And I think that the discussion about it being proprietary can be in some cases a smokescreen, because there should be a rise of AI evaluation organizations. You should get an external group to put your algorithm under the hood on those things. We peer review all kinds of other stuff. We should be peer reviewing some of this. You don't give away your secret sauce. Businesses sign contracts to do all of this, but there is the emergence of an industry for certification of AI for some of these things, but they don't have enough tools to be able to do this yet. And so that is also a limitation. And every tool that we've currently developed the market works to work against it as fast as it can be deployed, because there's money to be made in racist AI. There's money to be made in sexist AI. There's money to be made in AI that's very fast. It's profitable, right? It can be profitable to lean into majority populations and say, I'm only dealing with this customer base that is extremely large and extremely predictive on something.
That's interesting. You mentioned it. I was reading a Harvard Business Review article, and because I wanted to know, I read all these case studies, these big explosions with the algorithmic bias, right? You mentioned the case with Compass, the criminal justice case, the Amazon case, and it goes on. And so I'm like, that's from 2018, 2019. What's happening today? The Harvard Business Review article was from 2023, and it said, unfortunately, we haven't fixed this yet.
No. And in fact, it's getting worse.